It began as just another morning in Washington, D.C., cloaked in its usual rhythm of marble steps, brisk suits, and carefully rehearsed words. Outside the Supreme Court, journalists waited with cameras poised, their breath fogging in the cold air. Few suspected what kind of headline the day would deliver. Fewer still could have imagined that one of the world's most recognizable figures, Elon Musk, would soon walk through those heavy doors, only to be thrown out in dramatic fashion. Why was he there? What business did a tech mogul have before the highest court in the land? And more importantly, how did it all go so wrong? The hearing that morning was set to address a deeply polarizing issue: the future of digital governance and the potential constitutional limits of private tech influence. Musk, having long styled himself as a defender of free speech and a disruptor of entrenched systems, had requested, against all legal precedent, to appear personally. He claimed he had evidence, something that would reshape the national understanding of how digital platforms intersect with constitutional rights. Many thought it was just another publicity stunt, another dramatic headline in a week already bloated with controversy. But then he arrived, walking past the press without a word, eyes hard, jaw set. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick. The justices were seated. The murmurs died the moment Musk was granted permission to deliver an amicus statement. He stood without notes, without hesitation. His tone was cool, but unmistakably charged. "I am not here to make friends," he began, pausing to scan the bench, "and I am certainly not here to remain silent when the machinery of control cloaks itself in the language of law." Was it bravery, arrogance, or something else entirely? Justice Barrett, presiding over the session, leaned forward slightly. Her face betrayed nothing, but those familiar with her courtroom could sense the shift. This was not going to be a typical hearing. Musk continued, challenging the judiciary's willingness to remain technologically illiterate while presiding over cases that affected billions. He questioned the court's impartiality, hinted at conflicts of interest, and even cited specific past decisions he claimed were influenced by corporate lobbying masquerading as legal scholarship. The room shifted from quiet tension to electric discomfort. Lawyers fidgeted in their seats. Court clerks whispered nervously. Even seasoned justices blinked more than usual. Then it happened, when Musk pivoted from policy criticism to personal accusation, accusing Barrett herself of philosophical bias rooted in archaic interpretations of liberty. The mood shattered. The silence that followed was not the reverent kind that courts are known for. It was the silence of 1,000 thresholds being crossed at once. And yet, was he wrong to challenge the very system that so often claims to be above challenge? Was this the unfiltered truth, or a billionaire's unchecked ego on full display? Barrett slowly raised her hand. "Mr. Musk," she said, voice measured but sharp, "you are here under the court's tolerance, not its obligation. You will conduct yourself accordingly." He didn't sit down. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile. Then perhaps it is time the court rethinks who it tolerates, and why. What followed would be remembered for decades. Gasps didn't echo in the courtroom, but they were felt. They passed through the space like invisible tremors, rippling through observers, clerks, and even the stone-faced justices who had weathered decades of litigation without ever seeing anything quite like this. Justice Barrett lowered her hand slowly, her gaze fixed not on the man before her, but on the deeper implications of what had just transpired. Elon Musk, still standing tall and unshaken, had called into question not just the conduct of the court, but the very foundation of judicial restraint. And now every eye in the room waited for permission to breathe, for a gavel to fall, for someone to take control. "Mr. Musk," Barrett said again, this time with steel edging her voice, "you are dangerously close to contempt. This courtroom is not a stage for provocation, but for Musk, it already was." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his words carried farther than any shout. "If truth sounds like provocation," he said calmly, "then perhaps the court should consider whether it is protecting law or merely preserving order." Somewhere in the back row, a journalist's pen stopped moving. A bailiff shifted his weight subtly, hand brushing the hilt of his radio. The energy in the room had changed, crackling with potential. Not for justice, but for rupture. Barrett's eyes narrowed. She had never expelled a guest from her courtroom before. Not in all her years. Not even during the chaotic confirmation process. Not when facing relentless ideological warfare from both sides. But this was something else. This was a direct affront to the institution itself, delivered with a billionaire's calm detachment and an undertone of menace. "You are excused," she said finally, voice clipped and final. "Leave this courtroom immediately." For a beat, Musk didn't move. A second passed, then another, and then he spoke, not to the court, but to the room. History will remember who silenced whom. The words hung like fog. Then, as if on cue, 2 security officers approached. They didn't touch him, not yet. They simply flanked him, silent and still, waiting for compliance. Musk's eyes scanned the justices one final time. No remorse, no fear. Only something far more unsettling: resolve. He walked out on his own. The doors closed behind him, muffling the sudden buzz of whispers that exploded the moment he was gone. Justice Barrett remained motionless, her face unreadable. But internally, the court had been shaken, not just by what was said, but by what it meant, that even in the most sacred halls of American jurisprudence, power could still enter uninvited and demand to be heard. Outside, the cameras caught everything. Musk exited into a chaos of flashing lights and shouted questions, his expression unreadable, his pace unhurried. Reporters swarmed, protesters shouted from both sides, supporters clapped, critics jeered, and through it all, he didn't stop. What was he thinking? Had he planned this all along? Was it a calculated moment meant to expose cracks in the system, or a reckless display of hubris dressed in rhetoric? That night, cable networks scrambled to dissect every word. Commentators debated whether he had crossed a legal line or illuminated a moral one. In every newsroom, the same question repeated like a mantra: what happens when one of the most powerful private citizens in the world declares ideological war against the highest court in the land? The story should have ended there, but it didn't, because the courtroom wasn't the only place Musk planned to speak. And what came next would drag the entire judiciary into the public square, where no robe, no gavel, and no tradition could shield it from the storm. By dawn the next morning, the footage had been clipped, dissected, re-uploaded, and captioned in every possible shade of bias. One headline called it, "The Fall of Decorum." Another, "The Rise of Truth." But all of them agreed on one thing: something seismic had occurred. Not just a courtroom disruption, but a fracture in the myth of untouchable authority. Elon Musk, now thousands of miles away at his private facility outside Austin, wasted no time. Before the Supreme Court statement could even be drafted, he went live, on his own platform with his own crew, using his own narrative. No gatekeepers, no filters. Behind him, a towering screen displayed the words, "Unrobed, the hidden machinery of control." The broadcast was sleek, surgically timed, and devastatingly effective. For the first 30 minutes, Musk laid out a carefully curated timeline of past judicial decisions that, he claimed, showed a pattern of selective constitutionalism. One, that favored corporate protections over individual liberties and entrenched power over open innovation. He didn't just accuse. He illustrated, using data, leaked memos, and testimony from anonymous insiders. But the most explosive segment came. At the 45-minute mark, a document appeared on screen. Musk said it was internal correspondence between a former federal advisor and an unnamed Supreme Court clerk. The text, if real, suggested that certain cases involving major tech regulation had been strategically deprioritized to avoid drawing attention during election cycles. It was a veiled accusation of political manipulation at the highest level. Skepticism was immediate, but so was the outrage. Legal experts were pulled into interviews, some defending the court's discretion. As normal procedure, others acknowledging that the leak, if authentic, raised serious ethical red flags. Barrett herself issued a rare public statement the following day, calling Musk's broadcast reckless, inflammatory, and categorically unfounded. But it was too late. The conversation had already left the hands of the legal elite and entered the bloodstream of the nation. Debates erupted on college campuses, in congressional chambers, on podcast circuits, and across kitchen tables. No one was spared. Not Barrett, not the bench, and certainly not Musk. Was he waging a vendetta because his interests had been threatened? Or was he pulling back the curtain on a system that had long relied on silence to maintain its legitimacy? In the weeks that followed, the consequences became undeniable. Public trust in the Supreme Court, which had already suffered under the weight of political polarization, plummeted to historic lows. Polls showed a sharp divide. Younger generations began demanding term limits for justices, mandatory digital literacy among the judiciary, and increased transparency for court deliberations. Protesters flooded Capitol Hill with signs that read, "Unrobed," and "Silence is not neutrality." But amid all the noise, a quieter, more strategic movement began to emerge. A group of constitutional scholars and civil rights advocates formed a coalition, publicly unaffiliated with Musk, but undeniably fueled by the fire he lit. Their goal was clear: to draft a legislative framework that would increase oversight over Supreme Court procedure without infringing on its independence. They called it the Glass Gavel Act. It was bold, ambitious, and entirely unprecedented. The legal establishment dismissed it as performative idealism, until one unexpected ally emerged. A retired Supreme Court justice, respected, moderate, and long since removed from the tribal warfare of modern politics, publicly endorsed the effort. Her statement was measured but profound. Institutions must evolve or they will erode. Integrity is not preserved by silence, but by scrutiny. With that, the movement shifted from protest to proposal. And standing on the periphery of it all, Musk did not gloat. He remained curiously silent, watching as the very court that had expelled him now faced scrutiny unlike anything in its history. What would he do next? Would he step aside, his point made? Or was this just the first phase in a far deeper plan, one that reached beyond courts, beyond law, and into the roots of who gets to shape reality? The Capitol's facade, normally serene behind its white pillars and cherry blossoms, looked different now. There were barricades, armed patrols, and buzzing drones circling above, not because of a physical threat, but because of something more dangerous, an invisible pressure building from within. The institutions were still standing, but their foundation was cracking under the weight of doubt. Inside, a special joint session of Congress had been called to discuss the rapidly growing unrest surrounding judicial transparency. The Glass Gavel Act, once a fringe proposal, was now on the docket. It had forced its way into the room not with lobbyists or closed-door bargaining, but with relentless public demand. Constituents were no longer asking for change. They were insisting on it. The hearings were packed. Lawmakers, legal analysts, and a rotating door of former clerks and scholars testified for hours, painting a picture of a court system revered for its principle, yet resistant to introspection. Some called it dangerous. Others called it divine. And then, without any formal announcement, Elon Musk arrived. He wasn't listed on the agenda. He wasn't technically invited. But as had become common, he didn't need to be. The moment he entered, Cameras pivoted. Murmurs spread like wildfire, and the room took a breath. It wouldn't exhale for hours. A senator yielded time. Musk walked to the witness table. There was no prepared speech, no aides by his side. Just the unfiltered presence that had already brought the judicial world to its knees. "I am not a lawyer," he began, "but I am a builder. And what I see here is a system too afraid to renovate itself for fear of seeing how fragile its foundation really is." He didn't plead. He accused. With every word, he painted the court not as corrupt, but as calcified, unwilling to adapt in a world that demanded agility, transparency, and relevance. Some senators tried to challenge him. Others dismissed him as an interloper meddling in matters he didn't understand. But the power dynamic had shifted. For better or worse, Musk wasn't merely speaking to Congress. He was speaking to the people watching from homes, classrooms, smartphones, and public squares. And they were listening. As the hearings dragged on, something unexpected began to take shape. Not a bill, not yet, but a consensus. That change was no longer a question of preference. It was a question of survival. Meanwhile, outside the legal bubble, a counter-movement had formed, led by legal purists, constitutional originalists, and defenders of judicial sanctity. Their message was simple. The court must remain beyond political influence, even if that meant resisting popular demand. They accused Musk of stoking populist fires with no respect for constitutional boundaries. They pointed to his fortune, his companies, his conflicts of interest. And in a moment that would soon become infamous, a former Solicitor General appeared on national television and said, "This is not reform. This is revolution, dressed in tech." The line went viral. And yet, even critics had to admit, the system was rattled. Trust had declined. Questions once reserved for academic panels were now being asked by grocery clerks and high schoolers. Who watches the watchers? Who interprets the interpreters? And if the law is only as strong as the faith we place in it, what happens when that faith runs dry? But in the middle of this philosophical storm, something grounded and real finally arrived. After weeks of negotiation, legal revisions, and relentless media scrutiny, a revised version of the Glass Gavel Act passed out of committee. It included modest enforceable reforms, mandatory financial disclosures for justices, an independent ethics advisory board, and digital literacy training requirements for all judicial nominees. It was not sweeping. It did not dismantle the court. But it passed. Narrowly, contentiously, triumphantly. And in the days that followed, as the nation exhaled, a moment of stillness emerged. Musk did not tweet. He did not stream. He did not issue a statement. Instead, he withdrew, out of sight, but not forgotten, because the court still stood. The Constitution still held. But something fundamental had changed. Not just the laws, not just the perception, but the people. They had found their voice. The headlines faded, the protests quieted, and the storm that had once rattled the highest court in the land seemed, finally, to settle. But what emerged in the aftermath wasn't a return to normal. It was something altogether new. Inside the Supreme Court, subtle changes took root. The newly formed Judicial Ethics Oversight Board quietly began its work, reviewing procedural gaps and flagging conflicts that had previously gone unnoticed. A newly implemented digital transparency protocol made all case deliberation calendars publicly viewable, revealing the inner rhythms of justice that had once been hidden in sealed chambers. None of this made the evening news. There were no celebrations, no televised ceremonies. But for the first time in decades, ordinary citizens began visiting the court not just to observe, but to engage. Students wrote papers on ethics reform. Tech entrepreneurs filed amicus briefs. With full confidence they'd be read, not discarded. Legal blogs started featuring explainers on how the judiciary worked and how it could be improved. There was no revolution, no collapse. There was simply light, and in that light, something even rarer appeared: humility. Justice Barrett, whose courtroom had once been the stage for the infamous clash, delivered a commencement address at her alma mater in the spring. Her remarks were brief, deliberate, and unlike anything she had said before. "There is courage in holding the line," she told the graduates. "But there is greater courage in admitting that the line must sometimes move." The crowd rose. Not in protest, not in deference, but in acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Elon Musk remained mostly silent. His companies continued their work. He declined interviews, turned down documentaries, and refused every political invitation extended to him in the wake of his courtroom moment. But in a rare sit-down at an engineering symposium, when asked about the incident, he said this: "I didn't go to change the court. I went because I could no longer stomach the silence." You don't innovate by staying in your lane. You innovate by breaking the road and building a better one. And with that, he moved on, but the country did not forget. In high school civics classes, students debated the Musk-Barrett confrontation not as a spectacle, but as a case study. In university halls, the Glass Gavel Act was cited as a modern turning point in American judicial philosophy. It had not stripped the court of its power, but reminded it of its responsibility. More importantly, it had reminded the people of theirs. Because the truth was simple and enduring. Democracy is not a statue. It is a living thing, shaped by friction, fed by questions, and strengthened not by those who agree, but by those who dare to ask more of it. And in the end, what had begun as a disruptive courtroom clash became something far more powerful. A moment of collective awakening. A reaffirmation that the pillars of power do not stand on marble alone, but on trust, and that trust, once tested, can be rebuilt. Not by institutions, but by people.